Can a dead man vote? But believe it or not, this isn't a joke. It's a real question that a court actually had to answer. And the way they answered it, well, it tells you everything you need to know about the huge challenges judges face every single day.
This video was created with AI to support SQE1 study. We are independent and have no affiliation with the SRA, Kaplan, or the SQE. We do not share exam content, and our videos are for informational purposes only and should not be used as legal advice. Please check and refer to primary legal sources and recommended prep guides as you study.
You know, a law is really just words on a page, right? Parliament passes it to tell us what we can and can't do. But what happens when those words are kind of fuzzy? Or even worse, when following them to the letter leads to a completely bizarre, nonsensical result? That's the big question. So how do judges take those words and turn them into actual real-world justice? Well, today, we're going to unravel that puzzle. All right, so here's our plan. We're going to open up that judicial toolkit. We'll start with the puzzle of written law, then dive into 4 key approaches judges use: the literal rule, the golden rule, the mischief rule, and the purpose of approach. Finally, we'll see how it all comes together as a judge's flexible toolkit. See, this is the thing. If you just read the words of a law literally, you can end up in some really strange places that make absolutely no sense. And that's where judges come in. Now, their job isn't to make the law, but to apply it. And to do that right, they have to figure out what Parliament, the folks who wrote the law, really meant by those words. And this whole process, it actually has a name. It's called statutory interpretation. It's basically the method judges use to decode the language of laws, or statutes, to use the official term, so they can apply them correctly. Okay, let's get into it. The first tool in the box, and really the starting point for any judge, is called the literal rule. The idea behind this one is super simple. You just read the words on the page and do exactly what they say. No more, no less. So, with the literal rule, judges give words their plain, ordinary, everyday meaning. You know, the dictionary definition. And there's a really important reason for this. It's all about respecting democracy. Parliament is elected by the people to make the laws, so the court's job is just to enforce what's written, period, even if the result seems, a little harsh.
And that brings us right back to our opening riddle about the dead voter. This comes from a real case called Whiteley versus Chappell. So here's what happened. A guy was charged with voter fraud because he pretended to be someone on the voting list. But turns out that person was dead. The law he broke said it was illegal to impersonate any person who was entitled to vote.
So this is where the literal rule comes crashing in. The court looked at that phrase, entitled to vote, and asked a very simple question. Is a dead person entitled to vote? And the plain, ordinary, literal answer is, of course not. So what happened? The guy was found not guilty. It's a completely ridiculous result, right? But it's what you get when you follow the words of the law to the absolute letter.
This case just perfectly shows the big problem with only using the literal rule. It can create these crazy loopholes and lead to outcomes that Parliament obviously never wanted. So that begs the question, what happens when the law, read literally, just makes no sense?
Well, that exact problem forced the courts to come up with a kind of common sense safety valve. And that's the second tool in our kit, the golden rule.
The golden rule is basically an exception to the literal rule. It says, hey, if following the literal meaning leads to a result that is just completely absurd or morally wrong, the court can tweak the meaning just enough to avoid that terrible outcome.
And to see this rule in action, let's look at a really powerful case called Re Sigsworth. The facts are pretty grim. A son murdered his own mother. Now, his mother didn't have a will, and the law at the time said that, if that's the case, her only child inherits everything. So the court was faced with a truly shocking question. Should a murderer be allowed to inherit the estate of the person he killed?
Now, if you read the law literally, the answer was, yes, he gets the money. But the court said, no way. They found that result to be just, repugnant. So they used the golden rule. They argued that there's no way Parliament could have ever intended for a murderer to profit from such a horrific crime. It's a huge step away from just blindly following words and a step towards a result that actually feels like justice.
Okay, so the golden rule is great for stopping really awful outcomes. But what if we take it another step? Instead of just waiting for something absurd to happen and then fixing it, what if judges could actually look for the problem the law was trying to solve from the very beginning? The mischief rule. With this one, Judges almost have to become legal historians, digging into the past to figure out what was going wrong that made Parliament pass the law in the first place.
So here's how it works. The court looks at what the situation was before the new law was passed to identify the mischief, the problem or the loophole it was trying to fix. Then they interpret the law in whatever way best stamps out that mischief and makes the solution work.
The classic case for this is Smith versus Hughes. The Street Offenses Act made it illegal for prostitutes to solicit customers in a street or public place. But here's the twist. In this case, the women were calling down to men on the street from their balconies or tapping on their windows. So, literally speaking, they were not in the street. So the court brought out the mischief rule. They asked, okay, what was the mischief here? What was the problem this law was meant to solve? And the answer was obvious. It was to allow people to walk down the street without being solicited. Since what the women were doing was causing that exact problem, the court found them guilty. It's a fantastic example of a court looking beyond the literal words to get to the heart of what the law was all about.
So, the mischief rule is all about looking back to fix an old problem. But what about now? Laws today are often more complex, and they need a more forward-looking interpretation. And that brings us to the final and most flexible tool in the kit, the purposive approach. This approach is way broader. Instead of just hunting for one specific historical mischief, judges try to figure out the overall purpose, the spirit, if you will, of the entire law. They're asking a bigger question. What was Parliament trying to accomplish with this law, and how does that fit into our world today?
A real game changer here was the case of Pepper versus Hart. To understand a super complicated tax law, the judges did something that had been basically forbidden for centuries. They looked at Hansard, which is the official record of what's said in Parliament. This was huge. It meant they could actually read what the government minister said the law was for, giving them a direct window into Parliament's intentions.
So, there you have it. We've gone on this journey from a super strict, literal reading all the way to looking at the broad, overall purpose of a law. And what's really important to get is that these aren't some rigid set of rules that a judge has to follow in order 1, 2, 3, 4. It's much better to think of them as exactly that, a flexible toolkit. A judge can pick the right tool for the job to find the best interpretation for the specific case they're looking at.
And you can really see how this all fits together on a kind of spectrum. On one end, you've got the super strict, literal rule. Then, to fix its problems, you have the golden rule. Moving along, things get more investigative with the mischief rule, trying to fix a specific problem. And at the far end, you have the wide-open, purposive approach, which is all about finding the spirit of the law.
So, what do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll tackle that very question in our next New to Law breakdown. Thanks so much for joining us, and all the very best with your revision.